Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. We got a very, very special guest back on the show. Audience favorite, a favorite of you and I. It's time to just sit down and hear a story about a mysterious disappearance. This one is the fourth in our Bennington Triangle mystery disappearances that we've been covering with this wonderful guest. But, Tim, before we get to that, how are you?
Doing great over here. Thanks for asking. Always great when we've got Ross Griffiths back on the show. He is an archives librarian from Worcester State University, and he helps us go through these episodes of the Bennington Triangle disappearances, Lance, and he is really excellent with his research and determining fact from fiction. It's really great stuff, and this episode is no different. And in this conversation, we speak about the very mysterious disappearance of 8-year-old Paul Jepson from Bennington, Vermont on October 12th, 1950.
And it is a unique one because he is the only one that is directly from the town that the triangle is named after, which kind of brings everything into perspective in regards to there being 5 of these disappearances. And just to refresh people's memories, we've done an episode on each one of them. We have Mitty Rivers, who disappeared in November of 1945, Paula Weldon, who disappeared in December of 1946, James Tedford, who disappeared in December of 1949, and now we're on to Paul Jepson, October 12th, 1950. So we got one more that Ross is going to bring to the table, and they just keep getting progressively more mysterious, in my opinion. Every one of them has their own qualities and elements of perhaps it's paranormal, perhaps there's a criminal element, but the fact that Paul was from Bennington and he was so young, and the circumstances around his disappearance, even where he was last seen, for sure last seen, is such a unique environment. And I don't want to give anything away, but just keeps getting more and more mysterious.
Really interesting stuff, and we go over possibilities and sort of our thoughts, and we really fire any question we can think of at Ross. So we really don't have a final thoughts at the end of this interview like we have been doing, because we kind of went over it with Ross like the last 20 minutes of the conversation. So we hope you enjoy this conversation, and definitely let us know what you think on YouTube or Spotify. You can comment as well as watch us right there on YouTube and Spotify.
And Tim, you can watch us right there in person coming up in September of this year in Denver, Colorado, September 5th, 6th, and 7th. We're going to be at CrimeCon. You can watch us in person and get a discount, 10% off your standard badge. Go to crimecon.com for 10% off using the promo code CrawlSpace, which is the name of our other show. All one word. And we got a very special guest there.
We sure do. We are speaking with death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan. He is a true professional in the field. He does his own podcast called Body Bags. Great show. And we are going to speak with him about the New England serial killer and the phenomenon that is happening with this case.
Fantastic. So again, crimecon.com, 10% off your standard badge by using promo code CrawlSpace. And if you don't catch us at the session, you can catch us at our little table there that's going to be on Creators Row.
And we do have a new premium service that you can subscribe to. We have it right there on Apple Podcasts. It's also clickable through Spotify. And now we have a membership option on YouTube as well. So you can explore whatever option you'd like as far as our premium service goes.
And I've heard this thing about this bonus show, and everyone loves it.
They sure do. Yeah, we're going to be doing more bonus shows, maybe a couple a month. So look for that soon. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Ross Griffiths to tell us about the disappearance of Paul Jepson. Thanks a lot for listening. Ross Griffiths, welcome back to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
We're doing fantastic, and the only reason why we're doing fantastic right now is because you have joined us once again for another one of these amazing disappearance stories that you keep bringing to the table. I'm so glad that we started doing this Bennington Triangle series, and yet again, you've brought this again, like I said, this amazing story to us. But I'm sure there are a few people out there who need a reintroduction. Can you fill folks in on who you are and maybe how we met?
I'm Ross Griffiths. I'm the archives librarian at Worcester State, and we met almost a year ago, I think, maybe 10 months ago, to talk about the mysterious disappearance of a Worcester State student back in 1934 named Etta Reel. And from that, the conversation continued into other mysterious disappearances. And I mentioned to you my interest in the Bennington Triangle, because this is a case where we had a cluster of 5 disappearances that have become attached to a lot of folklore and mythology. And being an historian and an archivist, I'm very interested in going to primary sources to try to understand what really happened. I'm interested in the facts behind the folklore. And so part of what I'm trying to explore in this series is some of the differences between what really happened and then what subsequent retellings told us happened, but also to provide some ideas for people who enjoy researching this stuff on their own, how to access newspaper archives, how to analyze evidence, etc.
Well, thanks again for joining us. This has been a great experience for us working with you and discussing these cases. So we really appreciate it. I'm sure our audience does as well.
Great. I'm glad to be here. I enjoy having these conversations, as somebody who does kind of research on the side and is curious about things like this. It's nice to have people to engage with who share the same interests.
And we love it because it's really like story time. The way these things come together is so natural and organic. Like, you tell us the details of this case, of the disappearance, and then that's like the first half, and then the second part, or maybe like the last third, we kind of go back and forth with some questions and everything. And it's a really well-structured machine that we have going on right now. But I'm kind of sad because this is a bittersweet episode here, because this is the last one, right?
There's one more after this.
No, there's one more.
This is number 4 out of 5. And so we still have one more episode to go.
Oh, wow. What an emotional roller coaster for me.
But I think this is an interesting case to talk about, because it was this disappearance in 1950 that got some people talking about something strange happening in the woods around southern Vermont. It was this disappearance that triggered some of those conversations that led to these subsequent talks about the Bennington Triangle. So we'll be able to get into some of that as the story progresses.
All right. So could you tell us a little bit about Paul Jepson?
Yeah, Paul Jepson was an 8-year-old boy who disappeared while accompanying his mother on farm chores back on October 12th, 1950. And part of what makes his case a little bit different from the rest, not just that he's the youngest of the people to disappear, but that his disappearance occurred within the town limits of Bennington. It's the only one that happened in the town of Bennington. And he happened only maybe, a mile or two from downtown Bennington in a kind of rural neighborhood on the northeastern side. So let's give a little bit of background to who the Jepsons were. The Jepsons were a farming family. They had a farm that was located on the northwestern side of Bennington. Mr. and Mrs. Jepson had been school teachers. They'd worked in public schools for a number of years, but around 1940, they became farmers. They moved to Bennington, where Mr. Jepson had been born and raised. They set up a farm. They had 2 kids. Paul was their oldest, who was 8, and they had a daughter who was 7. And Mr. Jepson was involved in civic affairs. He was the tax collector for the town of Shaftesbury, which is right outside Bennington, for many, many years. He served on the school board. He was also the caretaker of the Bennington town dump. And this dump will play a very important role in the story of what happened to Paul Jepson. There's something about little Paul that we should know from the beginning, which is he was a child who had some special needs. Based on some of the descriptions of him in these newspaper articles that I accessed, it sounds like he had an intellectual disability, and he might have had a physical disability. He may have had mild cerebral palsy, because the way they describe some of his movements, the way that he walked, he had a little bit of physical coordination problems. And his disabilities were significant enough that he was not enrolled in school. So his younger sister was going to school. Paul was not going to school. He was staying at home with his parents, hanging out with them during the day. I think because they were school teachers, we might assume there could have been a bit of a homeschooling situation going on. But essentially, It was a stay-at-home kid who hung out with his stay-at-home parents all day. So on Thursday, October 12th, Paul's mother took him in their family pickup truck out to the Bennington town dump. This is maybe about a 15-minute drive from the farm where the Jepsons lived. The dump was located on the northeast side of Bennington along East Road. So if you were to look at a map today, East Road is a road that runs north and south on the east side of Bennington. It's a couple of miles long. It goes up to the town limits to the north. About halfway all up this stretch, there was an area of land that we used as a dump. Now, this is not a sanitary landfill like we have today, where municipal garbage trucks dump their trash and sort of compact it and bury it under soil. This is simply a kind of low-lying area. There's kind of a ledge. People would back their cars or trucks up and just dump their trash into this field. Household garbage, furniture, appliances, automobile tires. And then periodically, Mr. Jepson would get a bulldozer and he would bulldoze this stuff into piles. And then the fire department would come by occasionally and do a controlled burn of all of this trash. This is a pretty typical arrangement for small towns before mid-century. By the 1950s and 60s, most towns were replacing their old dumps with landfills. There was some controversy in Bennington about the dump. It was polluting waterways. When they would burn it off, it would fill the town with smoke. There were objections to the dump. But as of 1950, this is still how the people of Bennington were disposing of their trash. The Jepsons kept a herd of pigs at the dump. And to us, that sounds a little bit archaic. But if we think about it, the pigs would forage and they would eat the organic waste in the dump. And you would sort of once a day go out and herd the pigs to a different area of the dump and kind of do a clockwise sort of herding over the course of the week. And, while you were there, you'd give them water, give them some fresh feed. And that's what Mrs. Jepson was doing that day. She drove Paul out to the dump at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And she left him unattended in the vehicle while she went to tend to the pigs. We might ask ourselves why she did this. First of all, back in 1950, leaving your kids alone in a car was no big deal, was not considered, dangerous. Secondly, the dump was not really a safe place for a kid. There's broken glass, there's sharp metal. Paul apparently had enjoyed picking up bits of broken bottles and tossing them and kind of hanging out on this embankment near the dump. They just didn't think it was safe. And we might imagine that she brought a coloring book or something for him to do while he was in the truck. She left him in the truck a little bit after 3 o'clock. Two witnesses saw her and the boy, two trucks that had gone to the dump. She goes to tend to the pigs. She comes back half hour, 45 minutes later. Paul is not in the truck. She proceeds to look around the truck. She can't find him. She starts to get panicky. She goes to a nearby house and she tells the people in the house that Paul has gone missing. The lady of the house, Miss Savage, accompanies Mrs. Jepson in the truck. They drive around together on East Road and some of the back roads around here looking for him. They can't find him. They return to that house and they telephone the police, and that initiates the police investigation. And unlike some cases we hear about from the past where the police drag their feet, they didn't drag their feet on this one. There was an immediate response. The county sheriff got involved. The Fish and Game Commission got involved, and he brought his deputies. They rounded up volunteers, and a large number of people converged on the Bennington town dump to look for this little boy. The initial suspicion was that he had left the vehicle to go find his mother, had gone and perhaps had fallen, had gotten injured. There were, little sinkholes and kinds of things. You can imagine what this environment would have been like. As the evening progressed, rain began to fall, the temperatures began to drop. It raised the sense of urgency. There's an interesting passage in a newspaper article that I shared where they sort of describe the scene after nightfall, where you have fire trucks and police vehicles parked around the dump with their headlights and spotlights shining into the dump. There's a cold rain falling. There are people climbing over garbage, turning over old mattresses, lifting up old tires, and all around them is this awful smell and these huge squealing pigs running around. And they describe this as really a grotesque, kind of harrowing scene. You can really feel that by reading these articles. The search goes on for a couple of hours. Somebody contacts the sheriff of Cheshire County, New Hampshire. This is about 60 miles to the east. This sheriff has bloodhounds that are apparently very, very good. And so the sheriff drives out around 10 p.m. to Bennington. He brings along his best bloodhound, whose name is Little Queenie, and they put Little Queenie to work, sniffing around the dump, trying to get the scent of this boy. They bring Paul's shoes. The dog sniffs the shoes. Instead of going into the dump, the dog makes a beeline to East Road and follows Paul's scent trail away from the dump up the road to an intersection. And based on the descriptions, it sounds like this might have been about a 5-minute walk. It's not super long. And at this intersection, Paul's scent trail stops. The police decide the scent trail ends at this intersection because the rains have washed it away. Remember, the rain starts falling. It gets heavier as the evening progresses. The scent trail gets weaker and weaker. And by the time 2 o'clock in the morning rolls around, the scent trail is gone. It's washed away. So the police say, well, the scent trail washed away. We don't know where Paul went from this little intersection. Paul's father, however, comes up with a different explanation. And he thinks that Paul might have been struck by a car and that a panicked driver picked him up and put him in the car and drove him away. And part of why Mr. Jepson thinks this is that Paul had developed a habit of wandering away in recent months. And once or twice when he wandered away, he was found walking kind of down the middle of the road and heedless of traffic. Now, if you look at East Road today, it's a fairly straight road. There aren't a lot of curves, there aren't a lot of dips. So if a kid was walking in the road at 3:30 in the afternoon, even on a cloudy Thursday in the autumn, you would see him. The odds of a driver kind of creeping up on him around a curve or something, it wouldn't have happened on this road. But that's what the father thought. He suspected Paul had been struck by a vehicle. But the police weren't convinced. And so they continued searching the dump and the adjacent areas. Now, I want to highlight the timeline for his disappearance because as the investigation proceeds, this timeline becomes important. We know that Mrs. Jepson and Paul were at the dump shortly after 3 p.m., roughly. The times aren't precise, but they're close. And then we know that Mrs. Jepson went to the neighbor's house maybe shortly before 4. Let's, for argument's sake, take 10 minutes of 4. At this intersection of Chapel Road and East Road, near this intersection, there was a country school, a little one-room schoolhouse. And that country school, which had 21 kids, dismissed at 3 p.m. and at 3:30. So some of the kids left at 3, some of the kids left at 3:30. And most of the kids from that country school who were walking home would have walked to that intersection where Paul's scent ended. And they would have been somewhere in that intersection around the time Paul would have been there. If we figure Paul leaves the truck and wanders up the road, let's say at 3:15 or 3:30, well, the kids from the country school were walking up around that same area. When the police interviewed the children at the chapel school, none of those kids saw Paul Jepson. And I think that's interesting because if you think about it, if you're a kid at a one-room school and you see a kid that doesn't go to school with you, you're going to remember that. Kids are very aware of kids who are strangers. So none of these kids saw Paul. The police also spoke to a woman who lived in a house near that intersection, who that afternoon was giving a rug making workshop in her front room. Her name was Mrs. Stratton. Mrs. Stratton and her students were sitting in her front room near her front windows, looking right out over the intersection. They didn't see anything. They didn't see a car stop. They didn't hear squealing tires, nothing. They may possibly have seen Paul, but there were other kids in the area because the school was letting out. But they didn't remember seeing a kid that looked like Paul. And so from this evidence, I don't know what to make of this. I think my analysis of this is that kind of narrows the window of when Paul would have been at that intersection. If we think about it, those two dismissal periods, 3 o'clock and 3:30, would have taken kids about 15 minutes to walk from the school to the intersection. So there would have been a lag. You would have had one group of kids who left around 3, another group who left around 3:30. If Paul had been at that intersection between those two groups of dismissals, he might have gone unnoticed. But we don't have any evidence of what happened to him from that point. If he was picked up by a car, it happened quickly and nobody saw it or heard it. He may have walked on from that point and then gone into the woods. We don't know. And the police didn't know. And so we're kind of left with this strange situation where we have a scent trail and a timeline and witnesses, but no witnesses who see Paul after he was in the truck with his mother, and no further evidence of where he went.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So the police really concentrated their searches on the dump, on the wooded areas adjacent, north and south of the dump. Paul's father had said that Paul had expressed an interest in wildlife, and he thinks that Paul might have seen a fox or some kind of animal and wandered out of the truck and went to follow it. But searches of the woods, they brought in Coast Guard helicopters to fly around the area. They had Boy Scouts searching. They weren't finding any trace of him. As the story hit the news, a couple of witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Paul, but most of those statements were dismissed. There was a woman several miles away who saw a kid sort of hiding in the bushes. The police actually were able to track down who that kid was, and it wasn't Paul. But there was one witness sighting that I think is interesting. On Sunday the 15th, this would have been 3 days after Paul disappeared, there was a woman who was driving along Route 67 in New York State. So Bennington's very close to the New York State line. This would be maybe, 5 miles west or 10 miles west from the area we're talking about. This woman was driving along Route 67. She saw a little boy walking by the side of the road. And when she gets home that day, she reads the Sunday newspaper and she sees this story about missing Paul Jepson. She calls the police and she says two things about Paul that were accurate. The first thing was she describes the color of the clothes he was wearing. Paul was wearing brown overalls and a red shirt. Now, the initial description of his clothing the day after his disappearance was incorrect. They amended that on Saturday. Brown overalls and a red shirt. The woman said she saw a little boy in brown pants and a red shirt. She also said the boy was, quote unquote, unconcerned about traffic. Now, that's interesting. Paul's father had told police that Paul was heedless about traffic, and this woman described him as unconcerned. I don't know what that means. I think it means he may have been walking in the road. Maybe he was walking too close to the road. But I want to know what newspaper this woman read that day, because I can't find any newspapers that describe those two features of Paul in the same article as of Sunday the 15th. The Bennington newspapers described his clothing the previous Saturday, on Saturday the 14th. The following week, there were articles that Paul was heedless of traffic and might have gotten hit by a car. But as of Sunday the 15th, I can't find the newspaper. And what that means to me is if she had no way of knowing what color clothes he was wearing or his general behavior around traffic, then I think her sighting is an interesting one. Obviously, I don't have access to all the newspapers she might have read. I don't have access to the Albany newspapers. If the Albany newspapers described his clothing and his demeanor around traffic, then we can say maybe she picked up that information from an article. But right now, I don't know how she would have known that. And I think that's worth paying attention to. We're going to talk about this lady once more before I wrap up, because there's something interesting about her we should know. But for now, let's just put that on the back burner. The police followed this lead. They spoke to this woman. Paul's dad didn't think her sighting was credible because she didn't describe Paul's unusual gait. But I'm not sure that a person driving by the highway would have noticed that. Your attention's kind of divided when you're driving down the road. The problem I have with her statement is that this is 3 days after he disappeared. And remember, it's in the low 40s at night. It's been raining. Are we going to say that a little boy who'd been sleeping rough in the woods for 3 nights in wet clothes is going to be fit to be walking along a highway 10 miles away, 20 miles away 3 days later? That's what I can't really square about her statement. We would have to explain, where was he for 3 days?
Right. And if that was him, why wasn't he like flagging down cars?
Well, he may or may not have been. There's so much about Paul we don't know. We know he had special needs. We know he wasn't scared of traffic. We don't know a lot about how verbal he was. We don't know a lot about whether he was friendly with strangers. He wasn't fearful because he wasn't afraid of wandering around. But was he a kid who would have flagged down a stranger and talked to a stranger? Would he have gotten into a stranger's car, or would he have run away from strangers? We don't know that. Part of me wonders, it's possible Paul was on the autism spectrum. They describe him as having an intellectual disability, but in 1950, that could have meant that he was simply neurodivergent. And people who are neurodivergent sometimes are fearless about going places, but may not want to interact with people. So he might have flagged down a car. I just think a kid who had been on his own for 3 days without food or water, even if he'd slept in a barn or some other kind of place, he wouldn't be in good shape. So I'm really skeptical about her sighting, but I'm also really intrigued. We also could speculate that there might have been a careless investigator who talked to her, who said, "Oh, was he wearing brown pants and a red shirt?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, that's what he was wearing." So we don't know. We don't know enough about this witness interview. I actually contacted the Bennington police and the Vermont State Police and asked if they had any police records of this case because I really wanted to get more granular. They don't have any records. The records were lost, the records were disposed of. So we don't have enough precision to be able to make really good guesses about this information. But I think her story is an interesting one. I think this witness sighting is an interesting one. There was one other thing that happened that's worth talking about, which is after a few days, maybe a week, some tensions rose between the Jepsons and the police. The Jepsons were not doing well emotionally. Mr. Jepson had practically camped out in his car by East Road near the dump, talking to investigators, hoping they would find Paul. Mrs. Jepson was understandably very distraught. She had a number of women friends at the house taking care of her. At some point, a few days after the disappearance, the police were at the Jepsons' house and they separated Mrs. Jepson from her friends and began questioning her in a room alone. Mr. Jepson found out about this and he was not pleased and he lawyered up. I don't think the investigators considered this suspicious, considering the context of this. They didn't stop cooperating. They just said, "Look, if you want to talk to my wife, she's going to have an advocate present." In fact, when you read the way the police describe this, they almost seemed like their feelings were hurt. They were like, "We were just trying to help. We had a great relationship. We don't understand why he's being like this." But I can understand why he would be like that. I think that was a very difficult situation to be in. They were under a lot of stress. But I want to emphasize the parents were fully cooperative throughout this investigation. There is nothing about their demeanor that seemed to raise suspicions. There are hints in the newspapers that were all kinds of wild rumors circulating. They don't say what those rumors were. Obviously, then as now, we understand that if something happens to a kid, it's often a parent, unfortunately, that does it. But we don't really have any grounds to point to Mrs. Jepson or Mr. Jepson as being suspects. I don't think. I don't see anything in the evidence that would suggest that. And as with the rest of these cases, as the days progress, public interest starts to wane. The searches begin to wind down. The last really big search occurred on the 22nd of the month. So this would be about 10 days later. This time they concentrated the search in an area that's called the Whitechapel Woods. It would have been to the east of East Road toward the western slope of Bald Mountain. And then there was an area called the White Rocks. And this was sort of a geological formation. And they sent searchers into the woods. They had dogs. They had hunters who went around, but there was no trace found. The last confirmed sighting of Paul, besides by his mother, are by those two truck drivers who saw him in the truck with his mother at the dump around 3 o'clock that day. And as time wore on, the searches ended and the parents were left empty-handed. The community was left empty-handed. And to this day, we still don't really know what happened to Paul Jepson.
That is one of the most eerie disappearances on a number of levels for a number of reasons. I think it starts off immediately with the fact that it's in Bennington. So while the other disappearances are mysterious and tragic and full of elements that could suggest everything from an abduction by a human or an abduction by aliens, this one seems to be sort of the staple in the Bennington Triangle phenomenon, because now we've actually put the town on the map directly. You know, we've put the pin in there. Like, this one took place right there in Bennington. And then with all of the details like the pigs and the trash and the dump and just this incredible search. So this one really gets under my skin more than the other ones, or you know, within reason. This one definitely gets under my skin. I do have a couple of questions. What was the neighborhood like around that intersection of Chapel Road and East Road? Were there a lot of homes there, and did police knock on all of the doors?
Widely spaced homes. It's a very rural neighborhood. Today, if you go there, you'll see a number of houses in the area look like they're kind of post-war ranch houses. But if you go back to 1950, it would have been a very sparsely populated neighborhood, widely spaced, sort of cottage-style frame houses, a lot of woods, some open fields. The police did, in fact, ask all the residents on East Road, all the way up to the town line, about a mile up the road, and nobody saw anything. Now, there's one element of geography I want to mention related to your question. If you go to Google Maps today and you say, show me the intersection of East Road and Chapel Road in Bennington, it takes you to a location near the town line, about a mile north of the area we're talking about. If you want to see what the actual intersection is, the intersection is East Road and Crossover Road. Now, East Road and Chapel Road are two roads that run parallel on the east side of Bennington, north and south. And then somewhere in the middle, there's a perpendicular road that connects the two. Today, that's called Crossover Road. On that little perpendicular road, there's a cottage that used to be the Chapel School. You can see it today. And so most sources from the 50s say the Chapel School is located on Chapel Road, even though today that road is called Crossover Road. But if you look at the neighborhood, it's not a desolate place. Yes, the dump was there. The dumps are always going to be on the outskirts of town. But if you went, a quarter mile south, there are houses. Farther south, there are businesses. So we're not talking about a very, very remote area. This is not like the area where Paula Weldon was, where Mitty Rivers was. So yeah, they did widely spaced houses, and the police did speak to all the residents of those houses on East Road.
Wow. And yeah, I'm looking at that now on Google Maps. It looks like there's even a something the same shape as the dump that's still there today. Looks like they call it Furnace Brook or something like that. But so if that sighting with that woman in New York was accurate, then yeah, he would have crossed several roads, right? Route 7 and some other roads, and then I guess walked into more woods.
Yes, and there are no other sightings. I mean, a kid walking around unattended in 1950 was no big deal. It didn't attract attention. But he would have had to have walked essentially through the northern reaches of the town of Bennington and then continued on a westerly direction on highways. Now, we're assuming that he got there under his own power. One of the stories about his disappearances when he sort of wandered away before was that he ended up in the village of Hoosick Falls, New York, which is about 5 to 10 miles west of the Jepson farm. I don't know if he got there under his own power or if somebody picked him up in a car and dropped him off at the police station. But he seems like, even though he may have had some mobility issues, he could move pretty fast. And 8-year-olds can move pretty fast. I think anybody who's worked with 8-year-olds knows that. So, but yeah, he would have had to cross a populated area to get to that spot in New York State. And again, we have no more eyewitness accounts besides that woman.
Okay. Speaking of his disability, was this something that was common back then, or were there other kids in his neighborhood or in the town that do you know of that had something similar, or like how uncommon was it? I guess my real question is, like, was he ever like shunned or ostracized for this?
We don't have enough information to be able to determine that. It sounds like the Jepson family was pretty well integrated into the community. We can assume that Paul accompanied his mother grocery shopping, doing other things. So he would have been a kid that if people knew the Jepsons, they knew Paul. He wasn't enrolled in school, so I don't know what relationships he had with other kids. But your question's an interesting one because 1950 is still the era of mass institutionalization of disabled people. And, I mentioned in the last episode with James Tedford, who may have disappeared in Brandon. Well, the village of Brandon had an institution called the Brandon State School. This was a state-run institution for disabled kids, residential school for kids just like Paul. And people like the Jepsons might have been under some pressure to send their child away. There were doctors who would tell parents, why are you trying to raise your disabled child at home when we have professionals at the institution to do it? So I think that the Jepsons, it seems, made a decision to keep their son at home. They were people who were aware enough of the world to know that there were other options. They were trained school teachers. We don't know what that decision was about. We don't know the circumstances of it because we don't know enough about them. But I do think that there's some evidence that these were parents who were determined to take care of and raise their disabled kid and integrate him into their lives as much as they could.
Right. So they probably felt like they had a handle on taking care of him.
We might assume that. You could say, well, if he happened to wander away, why did she leave him in the truck? And I think that there's a relatively straightforward answer to that. First of all, there was the habit of taking him to the dump. She probably had left him in the truck multiple times without issue. It sounds like his wandering habit had been a recent one. And third, parents pick their battles. When you've got a kid, especially if you have a kid with special needs, you got chores you have to do, you've got tasks you have to do, and you also have to keep an eye on your child. You make the best decisions you can make in the circumstances that are handed to you. So I say that because I don't want people to come away with an understanding that she was somehow being neglectful or careless. There's no evidence of this. Like I said, we don't know much about the Jepsons, but what we see are parents who were taking appropriate care of their children and who demonstrated appropriate anxiety and grief when one of those children disappeared.
And that was every day that they had to go move the pigs from one side of that area to the other?
You apparently move the pigs every day. I'm picturing, like I said, I'm picturing sort of a clockwise kind of thing where you herd the pigs to one spot, then you herd them to the other. And like I said, there was probably water, probably had to fill a water trough, may have had to use supplemental feed, but it was a daily chore. And so Paul would have known the area well. His mother would have known the area well. This was a routine day where this disappearance occurred.
Right. So on one hand, it seems like there's some familiarity there. Maybe he accompanied his parents multiple times a week. But also, it strikes me as kind of a dangerous area because if you're walking on the trash and things like that, who knows? Like you could probably fall beneath some trash and get covered pretty easily.
Yeah, and that's the argument why she kept him in the truck, that she had decided it wasn't safe to have him wandering around the dump. There's one issue I want to bring up that some people might be thinking about right now, and it's kind of a gruesome one, but is it possible the pigs had something to do with his disappearance? Domesticated pigs can occasionally be aggressive. People get bitten by pigs sometimes, and pigs will consume a body if given the opportunity, flesh and bones. And this is a big herd of pigs, 60 some pigs. But the period of time between his disappearance and when the police arrived at the dump was like an hour. And I don't think realistically pigs could have made a human body disappear in an hour without leaving any kind of evidence. There was no blood, there was no clothing, there wasn't a button, there wasn't anything. And so I just want to kind of put that out there and kind of dismiss that, even though I think that's something the police might have thought initially. It wasn't something that was discussed in these articles, but it was something that I was thinking of as I was running through the possibilities in my head.
Same. Yeah, for the pigs to kill Paul, that's I think a stretch in that amount of time, but certainly they could have consumed him if he was there.
Yes, but I don't think they could have in an hour and a half without there being some kind of really obvious sign of it. And I think that let's think about the people who are doing the search. A lot of these people are farmers. Some of those farmers have pigs. they had to have thought of this possibility and they had to have considered that possibility. And I would assume they would have looked for traces or evidence of that possibility. And so I don't think we need to think too much about that.
Right. And I was also wondering if anybody had suggested maybe doing a autopsy on one of the pigs, maybe slaughtering the pig and doing an autopsy, getting contents.
There didn't seem to be any indication of that. And it seemed interesting to me that while they were doing the search, they hadn't corralled the pigs. I mean, the searchers are digging through this trash and the pigs are still running around. Kind of, it gives you a sense of kind of the mess that sort of forensic investigations were 75 years ago. Obviously, searching a garbage dump would be horrible anyway, but I think that if I were in charge of this investigation, even as a complete amateur, one of the first things I would do is put the pigs in a truck or corral them somewhere and get them out of the way. There were also a lot of rats running around the dump. This is another thing that searchers were encountering, sort of added to the gloom of the situation that searchers faced.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Were there any like sinkholes or anything in the dump, like in the piles of trash that they encountered?
There were some descriptions of those. There were areas where trash had sort of been buried and there were little sinkholes, and that was one of the areas they were searching. From what I've been able to tell, the dump would have been in use for about 20 years. And so considerable amounts of debris had piled up over the years. But if we remember, the debris was being sort of shifted around, bulldozed around, periodically burned off. I think part of why they were so intensive searching the dump, even after the scent trail was found wandering away, they really did want to rule out the possibility that you brought up, that he had sort of slipped down into a crevice or something. But it sounds like they really pulled that dump apart as best as they could over about 2 weeks, and they didn't find any trace of anything.
What about footprints?
There were some footprints that were found. There were footprints that were found quite a distance away in an area off a road, but it was ambiguous as to whether they could have been Paul's. Some reports say that the police noticed the footprints and were interested. Other sources say they found the footprints, they were too big. They were an adult footprints. And so there were footprints that were found, but I don't think that those led to any insights into where Paul might have gone. They were just kind of discarded as probably not Paul.
Okay, how about any other accounts of children going missing in New York or along a highway that was around that area?
You know, if you go through the papers from this point, there are kids going missing. But from what I've been able to determine, those kids ended up turning up safe. There are kids that ran away. There were kids that, some of them were teenagers who went off to work on a farm, were made at their parents. There were kids that just weren't where they were supposed to be. Remember, this is the era of free range childhood. So kids were out biking around, walking around miles from home. And sometimes they got in trouble. Sometimes they spent the night when they weren't expected, were in a place that they weren't expected to. Not everybody had phones in their house. Nobody had answering machines. And so a parent might report a child missing. There were also kids that were having trouble at home. There was a girl who was living with her aunt and uncle because there was some home trouble and she ran away. But from what I've been able to see, there didn't seem to be any pattern of missing children in this area that were linked in any way to Paul's disappearance. There was one flurry of interest around a person who had escaped from a hospital for the criminally insane. So a group of inmates from Concord, New Hampshire had escaped from a hospital that were described as quote unquote sexual psychopaths in the newspapers. 7 of them were captured right away. A last one was on the loose at the time Paul disappeared, and there were some suspicions he was headed to New York State. So the police were wondering if he had passed through Bennington. But it sounds like this guy was eventually tracked down, and he didn't have access to a car. So it was sort of one of those sort of far-fetched theories. But I think it did show that even in a more innocent time, there was this understanding that there were predators who might harm a child. And that was one of the possibilities they were considering when they were investigating this. Now, one thing to keep in mind about East Road that's interesting is that it's not really a highway. When Paula Weldon disappeared, she was hitchhiking along highways that included people who were traveling long distances from out of state. East Road is really pretty regional. It's a road that people use mostly to travel from Bennington up to some of the villages north of Bennington. And so chances are anybody driving on East Road would probably be a local person, which I think narrowed any sort of suspect pool. It doesn't mean a stranger couldn't have been there, but it wasn't a road where there were a lot of strangers, where there were a lot of people from outside the area. And I think that caused the police to be a little bit more skeptical of the kidnapping angle. Even though there could be a local predator nobody knew about, I think they were, if they're thinking about a total stranger doing this, the fact that it happened along this road somewhat reduced that possibility of it being somebody who wasn't from Bennington or one of the surrounding towns.
Yeah, I could see that. Now, where is this dump in relation to the other disappearances we've spoken about?
It's quite a distance away. Paula Weldon was probably, if memory serves, about 7 miles south and east of this area, but it's a long 7 miles because there are mountains in between. So between this area and the long trail is Bald Mountain, which is a considerably large peak. So there's quite a bit of wilderness, mountain wilderness between here and the Weldon and Mitty Rivers case. And James Tedford, of course, was way up in Burlington, which is many, many miles north. So it's not particularly close geographically or really environmentally to these other disappearances. And that's a good point to bring up. If you read subsequent retellings of the story, even back in the later 1950s, Fate magazine had written about Glastonbury, the mysteries of Glastonbury Mountain, and they mentioned this disappearance. Some of those articles will say, Paul Jepson disappeared on the same spot as Paula Weldon. Well, he really didn't. He disappeared, 8 to 10 miles away in a completely different area. He was nowhere near. There are some people who have suggested that Paul may have been attracted to the mountains and may have gone in an easterly direction toward Bald Mountain, which if he had continued walking for days and days, he would have found himself over to the Long Trail. But it seems unlikely that that really happened. And if he did, there's no evidence for it.
It's interesting that you just mentioned Paul being interested in the mountains, and I was just reading one of the articles that you sent us, and his father said that they had a trip to the mountains in Wilmington. What were these mountains, and was this the first time that anyone had known Paul was interested in mountains?
Well, it sounds like the mountains of Wilmington would have been similar to the mountain ranges in Vermont. It just would have been leafy, green, woodsy. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that Paul had a long-term interest in mountains. It just sounded like something where he was charmed by his experience visiting the mountains and wanted to go back. And that did lead people to think maybe he wandered in that easterly direction to get close to these mountains, which is a possibility. However, if he had gone in that direction, I still think he would have been seen, because if you're at that intersection of Crossover Road and East Road and you walk east toward Bald Mountain, you walk right past the Chapel School. You walk right past people's houses, and nobody saw him. So if he went in an easterly direction, he went in a direction off a road through a wooded area where nobody would have seen him. They did look for that area, but they didn't find any evidence that he was there.
Right. Yeah, there are definitely some houses east. Definitely could have been seen, but if he got past Chapel Road, it's like miles of wilderness.
That's complete wilderness. Yeah, even if you look at it today, it's the wilderness begins right up against this area. If you continued in the easterly direction, you're on the slope of Bald Mountain, and there is nothing in that area. There might be some logging roads, there might be some hiking trails, but it is solid woods. And if he had continued in that direction up over Bald Mountain to the other side, that area beyond that mountain is where Mitty Rivers was. And of course, with the Mitty Rivers case, I think the most logical answer was he got lost in really, really deep woods and he was never found. So that gives you a sense of how close we are to that really intense wilderness. But again, 8-year-old kid, it's late in the afternoon in October. The sun's going to be going down in 90 minutes. How far in the woods is an 8-year-old kid going to go once the sun goes down? I don't have expertise in the behavior of lost people. And there are people who study this, people who do search and rescue are like, do people walk in circles? Do they go this way? Do they go that way? I imagine lost children are not going to go into a dark forest. I think they're going to sit down. Even a kid who might be neurodivergent. That's my speculation based on just my own experience and my life experience. So I don't know. I think adults might have a reason to go deep, deep, deep into the woods. I just don't know whether an 8-year-old kid is going to.
Okay, so if you were to continue on this easterly journey from the intersection of Crossover Road and Chapel Road, eventually, like a long, long distance away through a bunch of wilderness, you come to an area that I'm just looking on the map here called Bear Wallow. And I'm wondering if bears were a problem in that area, and perhaps he had wandered in there and came upon some mother bear protecting her cubs or something.
I suppose it's a possibility. I did not see that particular scenario described in any of these cases, or in any of the articles, but investigators were quoted as saying one of the possibilities is he did wander into the woods and succumb to the elements or lack of food and water. So the idea that he did go deep, deep, deep into the woods and die of something was something that investigators were looking at. And I suppose, wild animals, even if we don't talk about an animal attack, if somebody dies in the woods, the body is rapidly broken down by wild animals. It doesn't take very long for a body to really disappear. And that's one of the reasons why some of these disappearances in woods, I think, remain unsolved. So that is a possibility.
Wow, Ross. Well, this is incredibly mysterious. I'm wondering if you have a thought or a theory on what happened to Paul.
This is the one that I'm least confident about having an answer to. All the rest of these, I think we can come to an answer that sounds plausible. As I'd said, I think that it's very likely Mitty Rivers got lost. I don't think it's a mystery if you look at the context of his disappearance. I do think that there's a good chance Paula Weldon hitched a ride with the wrong person. That's what her parents thought. And I think that there was an opportunity for that to happen. James Tedford's a wild card because it sounds like he had a mental illness, and we don't know exactly where he was when he disappeared. But I think it's possible that he wandered away from a bus stop and succumbed to the elements over a period of time and wasn't discovered. I don't think that's implausible. But this is a case where I just don't know. I do have a hard time with the idea of a little kid walking deep into the woods by himself late in the afternoon. I just can't see that. And like I said, I speak from experience. When I was a kid growing up in the woods, 8 years old, once the sun starts getting low in the sky, I'm not going into the woods. And while Paul had some intellectual disabilities, I don't think that would mean he would behave in such a different way of other children. Maybe it did, but I don't know about that. But at the same time, for it to be an opportunistic predator, there's a really narrow window of time where he could have been picked up by a car and not seen by somebody. And yeah, that could have happened. Thinking about this case brings up a spooky childhood memory that I have. When I was a little younger than Paul, this is the sort of mid 70s, I lived along a rural country road. And one day I wandered too far from home out to the road where I wasn't allowed. And I walked up the road and a big black car pulled up next to me. And this guy slid across the bench seat and he opened up the passenger door and said, "Hey, let me give you a ride." He was real nice. Now, I'd been told don't get a ride with strangers, so I walked the other direction. And I don't know if this guy was a bad guy or not, but if I had gotten in that car, that sequence would have been 10 seconds and nobody would have seen it, you know? And so if you look at cases of stranger abductions, that's how it happens. That the kid is there 1 minute and gone the next. No one's kicking and screaming because, hey, let me give you a ride. Kid gets in the car. There's no sound. There's no struggle. I think that could have happened, but it would have happened in a window of time when nobody was looking at that intersection where his scent trail ended. Or he continued up the road. And because school was dismissed around that time, people did kind of see him out of the corner of their eye. They didn't think anything of it. And then something happened when he was walking farther up the road. So it could be either. It could be going into the woods and succumbing to the elements. It could be an opportunistic predator driving along the road quietly and quickly picking him up. I even thought about the possibility there are these people that steal children to raise them. You hear about infants back in this day, people would leave their babies in carriages outside the store sometimes. And there are one or two cases where the baby's gone when the mother comes back. And there are a type of dysfunctional person who steals a child to raise a child. But Paul seemed kind of old for that. He's 8 years old. He's kind of grown, but his special needs might make him someone who can't communicate who he is, where he's from. So we could imagine a scenario where he lived on with someone else, somewhere else, but nothing really fits. We just have a kid who's there. We have a scent trail that ends and then nothing. And so this is a case where I think it's really a puzzler. There just doesn't seem to be any direction to go in.
Wow. Well, you've done it again. You've captivated us for an entire story about this unfortunate young boy. And then you capped it off with a story about yourself. And I think, speaking on behalf of Tim and the audience, I'm glad that guy didn't pick you up and you said no to the ride, because we wouldn't have these moments. Yeah. Selfishly speaking.
That's spooky.
I empathize with Paul so much because I was a little wanderer. I was a kid who, as soon as you turn your back, I was out the door. I loved being on the road. And I can speak from experience. Most strangers are really nice. Like, I did get rides with strangers when I wasn't supposed to, when I was a little bit older. And the vast majority of people who, when they see a kid, they're nice to the kid. We're so aware of stranger danger. I think strangers get a bad name. Obviously, don't talk to strangers. Don't let your kid talk to strangers. But really and truly, most strangers are good, decent people, and we shouldn't be so quick to judge everybody. But I mentioned that woman on Route 67, and there's one little detail I want to wrap up with, because it wouldn't be the Bennington Triangle unless something weird happened, right? Really weird. Okay, so the woman who thinks she saw Paul on Route 67, her name was Helen Lemna, Lemnah, and her husband's name was Marshall Lemna. They lived in Jonesville, New York. Well, if we go back to the James Tedford case, Tedford was last seen at the Burlington bus depot before he got on the Bennington-bound bus and disappeared into oblivion. He was last seen by an old buddy of his named Walter Lemna, Lemnah. Walter Lemna lived in Winooski, north of Burlington. I spent a lot of time this weekend on Ancestry trying to determine the relationship between Walter Lemna of Winooski, who was the last person to see the previous disappearance, and Helen Lemna of Jonesville, who may possibly have been the last person to see Paul Jepson. I can't find any relationship. Now, I'm going to assume there's some relationship. It's an unusual last name. I've never known anybody named Lemna. But these two people with this very unusual name are the last people to see someone in this sequence of disappearances. Isn't that weird?
Yes.
Really
wow.
weird. Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah. Great observation there.
Jeez.
If your name is Lemna and you happen to see people right before they disappear, maybe you should email the show, because I want to know more about this.
Yeah, any Lemna, please email the show. Let us know how common or uncommon your name is, especially in the Northeast, because they probably, you're right, they probably would have been related or known each other in some way, I would think. Even though they're lived in different states, that isn't that far away. What are they, 10, 15 miles?
Well, Burlington to this area, it's a little bit longer than that. It's quite a distance. And we have to remember, the population density in Vermont and Eastern New York, relatively low population density, rural traditions where you had farms with lots and lots of kids. Every family has 6 kids. They all stay in the same area. It's not unusual to see the same names pop up over and over again. People with the same name as the town they live in because great-grandfather founded the town. That's pretty common researching this particular area. But when I saw that woman's name associated with this case, a chill went down my spine, because I thought, I can't believe that 2 people with the same unusual name in 2 sequential disappearances. It reminds me of the fact that there were all these James Tedfords around the time our James Tedford disappeared who were having problems. There was a James Tedford that died. There was a guy that fell into a lake. It's just weird. It's like the simulation sometimes shows up in strange ways if you believe in the simulation.